Thanks so much for joining us for the 5th Annual Aspen Cyber Summit. My name is Betsy Cooper, and I'm the Director of the Aspen Tech Policy Hub, a Bay Area-based incubator training technologists how to do policy, and I'm very pleased to introduce our next panel. Before we go on, please feel free to check out the full summit agenda and bios of all of our speakers at aspencybersummit.org. I also want to thank FireEye, Intel, and Proofpoint for making this week's summit possible and helping us convene such an important set of conversations in such a complicated year. We would also like to acknowledge Blue Vector, SICPA NA, and the American Gas Association for their additional support. Up next, we have a panel examining the threat of ransomware, moderated by Lily Hay Newman, Senior Security Writer for Wired. Lily, over to you.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. I'm really looking forward to this panel about ransomware. It's just become unbelievably prominent in 2020. So I'm really thrilled to be talking about it today. And I'm joined by a great set of panelists who I'm excited to hear from. The first is Charles Carmakal. He's the Senior Vice President and CTO of FireEye. The next is Khoo Boon, a board member at the CyberPeace Institute and a former president of Interpol. And last but not least, Maria Thompson, who's the Chief Risk Officer for the state of North Carolina. So I think we have really great representation from a bunch of different levels as everyone is trying to grapple, scrambling to deal with this issue and grapple with this issue. So to all of you, welcome. I really want to just ask first, and maybe we can start with Charles and then we'll go around. What is it about 2020 that has caused this sort of flashpoint for ransomware and just so, totally upped the level of intensity to this unbelievable degree amidst a pandemic, amidst everything that's going on this year?
Yeah, absolutely. First of all, thanks for having me here. So I'll tell you, ransomware is by far the #1 cybersecurity threat that we're dealing with today. And we anticipate this is going to be, it can continue to be the #1 cybersecurity threat that we deal with over the next few years until something's done about it. If you ask me how bad was the problem last year, I'd say it was terrible. If you ask me how bad the problem is today, I'd say somehow it managed to get worse. And I say that for a few different reasons. First of all, what really changed over the past 12 months or so is how the ransomware operation has changed. So years ago, we used to see threat actors just deploying encryptors across environments. And so victim organizations could recover systems and data if they had decent backups or if they were able to rebuild their environments. And so a lot of times they didn't need to pay. Nowadays, and over the past 12 months or so, we've seen a number of threat actors steal materially sensitive data from victim organizations. And so the extortion demand has become multifaceted. Not only do people pay to get the tools to get their systems back online, but they're paying a threat actor for the promise that they won't publish the data that they've stolen. They're also paying for the instructions for how the threat actor actually broke into the environment. And so if you look at the problem today, most financially motivated criminals are monetizing their intrusions through ransomware and extortion operations. And they're making a lot of money in the process. It's very common for us to see 7 to 8 figure extortion demands. And we see a lot of victim organizations paying, unfortunately. And that's changed significantly over the years. In prior years, we used to see maybe an average of 6-figure extortion demands. Now 7 figures seems to be the new floor for any medium-sized organization that has the ability to pay. So it is by far the biggest problem. And I know we'll talk about it a little bit later on, but if you look at the acute problem of ransomware at healthcare organizations, I mean, it doesn't get any worse than that. Well, actually, it could get worse. I hope it doesn't get any worse than that because it is so bad right now, unfortunately.
Yeah, Maria, I think that's a good segue to hear about some of the things you all have been dealing with in North Carolina and how 2020 has been for you.
Sure, thank you, Lily. And I can attest to everything that Charles said. 2019 was a bad year for us at the state. 2020, we have surpassed the numbers of ransomware incidents that we've seen impacting our counties, our cities, our K through 12s, our community colleges. We're seeing them hit hard. We have a reported 16 ransomware incidents that that's been reported to us. Again, there's always that caveat that's been reported to us that we've actually engaged with these entities to help them. We're talking about counties, again, cities, community colleges. We've had 5 K through 12s that's been impacted. So as you think about all this remote work that we're dealing with this pandemic, the impact to these schools when they have to now figure out how can they produce, training for these kids, these K through 12 students, while dealing to recover with the environment. And as Charles mentioned, we have seen also an increase in exfiltration. And so from a state perspective, we have resources that we bring there to help these entities that are impacted has been really crucial in ensuring that we have some stability moving forward. But yes, it is definitely getting worse for us. And, we are doing what we can to educate all these entities across the state on what actions to take, what are the resources that are available to them, and steps that they should do, and absolutely not pay the ransomware, which I'm sure we'll cover later on.
Right. Yeah. And, I think it's great to be able to talk about response and incident reaction at sort of all these different levels, the state perspective. Khoo, Boon, I'm curious about also, what you're hearing internationally, sort of the international law enforcement perspective. What has 2020 signified in the ransomware space?
Yes, thank you. Well, I looked at some Interpol figures arising from COVID-19, and surprisingly, from the police perspective, I think they did surveys of police forces. Ransomware is number 2. It's not number 1. Number 1 remains phishing and scams and frauds. I guess it's the number of people who are reporting, because the others affect individuals, whereas ransomware affect companies and not all of them report. But I have no doubt that ransomware is a huge thing, because I think criminals have now been disrupted from their usual crimes owing to stricter border controls and restricted movements during lockdowns. And of course, there's less economic activity. So they are looking for alternative revenue streams. I think, as Charles has mentioned, it's very profitable. And now we've got cybercrime or malware as a service. So this gives easy entry for other criminal groups who been derived of their normal stream of incomes, have now ventured into this enterprise. And there's also easy entry into darknet markets. And we know that the reach is global, because attacks are not geographically limited. The same group may attack a country like Japan or Middle East, or even the US. They don't discriminate. And of course, you've mentioned that targets have changed from individuals to businesses, governments, and critical infrastructure, because there's more to lose and people are more willing to pay because of the crisis situation. Thanks.
Yeah, maybe just to add on to what you just mentioned. Yeah, we've seen a number of threat actors shift their operations in terms of how they're monetizing their intrusions to focus on ransomware. And to give you an example, there's a group that we track, we call them Fin6. Fin6 is a highly notorious threat actor that was responsible for a lot of credit card theft at a lot of very large global merchants over the years. And historically, we exclusively saw them steal credit card information from victim organizations. And nowadays, we sometimes see them steal credit card data. But if you think about how you monetize the theft of credit card information, you've got to steal credit card information. You've got to wait long enough to get enough unique cards. And then you've got to sell it somewhere. And you usually sell it for a few dollars, but you make your money when you sell it in bulk. And you think about a ransomware operation, which may take a few days and may net you, 10x what you would have otherwise been able to make through a credit card theft operation. And so now we see Fin6 mostly focus on deploying ransomware. We're starting to see Fin7 start to deploy ransomware. And so we see a lot of new actors deploying ransomware, we see a lot of older actors that have historically focused on something else now shift over to this multifaceted extortion demand.
Yeah, and I think that's a really interesting point, that not only are actors shifting to ransomware, but as a number of you were detailing before, there's also this sort of layered extortion that's going on. It's not simply ransomware, there's also the data extortion, and as many elements as can be crammed in there to up the urgency to motivate a payment. So the payment question is the big one. And I'd like to talk quite a bit about, different ways that the global community can react to this. But, Maria, you were talking about don't pay, right? Encouraging victims not to pay. Just what is the practicality of that? And can you talk a little bit about how, my understanding is there are sort of numerous benefits to, if you possibly can, refusing to pay and trying to remediate and rebuild a different way. Why is that your recommendation?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a very tough decision to make. When you tell an entity that's down, when you tell a county that has all these services that they're providing to their citizens, whether it's for child support services or even critical infrastructure, we're talking about criminal justice systems that are being impacted, 911 systems that are being impacted whenever there's a ransomware. So when you tell an organization don't pay, there's always that pause, that pregnant pause. It's like, well, what can what services can you provide? And that's one of the things that, from a state perspective, we have been very strong at, as far as encouraging these entities, that the reason why we're saying not to pay, it's because we have services that we can provide. We have a partnership with our National Guard cyber team. We have partnerships with local IT teams called strike teams. And these are individuals that, as soon as we hear that there is a ransomware incident that's ongoing, we have a scoping call. We'll launch boots on the ground out there to help them, to guide them, to remediate, to recover, to do the forensics on their environment, to get them back up faster. So we're not just saying don't pay and leaving them to figure out how they can recover. We're saying don't pay, here's how we're going to help you. And we're going to give you a strategy on how you can recover and rebuild your environment in a more secure manner. Because what we've seen is entities that have been impacted, there is a rush to bring the environment back up, which usually ends up with reinfection within a month or so, sometimes even earlier than that. So again, having a methodical approach on how to recover that environment is key. But then look at, why are you paying that ransom? I have to tell you, this has been something that has been a pain point for me. We've seen most recently this year that some of the entities that have cyber insurance, they're being, I would say, not highly encouraged to pay the ransom by these entities that, that they're working with their insurance carriers. Which is something that really runs counter to what we're saying right now, because obviously there's a vicious cycle. We keep paying, they keep deploying the ransomware. If we keep monetizing this situation, it will never go away. So we have to take a strong approach and not pay the ransom.
Yeah, and from my perspective, I agree with what Maria said, but the counterpoint here is, well, I'll start by saying I've had an evolving position on whether or not you even engage with a threat actor, have a conversation with them, or even whether or not you decide to pay. And I don't encourage my clients to either pay or not pay, but I do encourage them to have a thoughtful conversation about what are the pros and what are the cons of paying. And so I'd love to share some of the considerations and some of the actual learnings here. So from a considerations perspective, I think Maria brought up a really good point around emergency services. So some cities think about, what is the impact? What's the business impact? What's the human life impact? And think about cities that are impacted. If people can't dial 911 and get police officers or fire departments or ambulances there, people could potentially die. And so you got to think about, what's the actual impact of having systems taken offline. You got to think about, what's the ability to recover on your own through backups or other business resiliency capabilities. And I'll tell you, by the way, a lot of times people get criticized for not having good backups. But I'll tell you, a lot of times victims actually have pretty good backups, but the attackers either destroyed the backups or the backup infrastructure is so taxed because every single server and every single workstation in the environment was taken offline in a matter of hours, that you can't possibly recover 40,000 systems with the existing backup infrastructure. It just takes weeks or months. It's just so taxed. And so we find out some victims choose to pay because they want to accelerate the process of bringing their network online. There's various reasons why people choose to pay. And I'm not saying you should pay or you shouldn't, but I do, again, I do encourage organizations to have a very thoughtful process and make the decision based on, a number of considerations. Other things to consider are, and some of these things may sound silly, but how reliable is the threat actor? And I know that sounds silly, but there are certain threat actors that have proven to be more reliable than others. Some are highly unreliable, so you would never consider paying them. But some have had a history of being reliable. And because of that historical reliability, that gives you some level of confidence that if you pay somebody $1 million, and by the way, again, as I mentioned, the average amount of money that people are asking for right now is in the millions. Sometimes I've seen payments between $10 and $30 million over the past 6 months. If you're going to give somebody $10 million, you want some kind of confidence and assurances that they're going to give you something that works. And so, there are security companies that track the reliability of threat actors in terms of, do they give working tools when they're paid? And if they don't have a good reliability score, they're not going to get paid. So their business model depends on it. But let me talk about, the learnings. What I find is most of the times when threat actors are paid, they technically have the ability to come back into the environment and re-extort the entity by redeploying encryptors or stealing new data. But for the most part, most of these threat actors choose to move on and just hit the next victim. And that's because they have such broad access to so many environments today that they don't have to re-extort the same entity multiple times. They could just hit the next entity. At some point in time, I know that's going to change. We're going to get a re-extortion by the same threat actor because maybe they just want more money, or the people that are members of the group get in a fight with each other, or maybe there's miscommunication. So it's inevitably going to happen. By the way, I've absolutely seen victims being hit by multiple distinct threat actors 6 months apart from each other. And they assumed that they were related incidents, and they weren't many of those times. Sometimes they could be, but many of the times they're not. And I'll tell you, before 2016, most of the threat actors that I saw that stole data, that asked for money in exchange for a promise to delete the data and not publish it online, the majority of those incidents, we saw the threat actors re-extort the entity or dump the data online at some later point in time. It's usually a year later or multiple years later. So I do anticipate at some point in time, we're going to start seeing the dump and release of a lot of the data that unfortunately has been stolen now, and that where the threat actors have been paid not to publish data. I find it sometimes funny. Certain threat actors will send a certificate of destruction promising that they've deleted data, or they'll share a video that shows them deleting the data. And yes, it shows a video of them deleting some data. Doesn't mean it's everything. Doesn't mean they don't have a copy of it. So yeah, the one assurance, not assurance is probably the wrong word, but the one thing I do realize is it's hard for attackers to maintain terabytes upon terabytes of data for so long. So it's probable that some of them are deleting some of the data that they stole.
That's an interesting point. Khoo, Boon, I'm curious about your thoughts on to pay or not to pay, because I feel like Maria and Charles really laid out why our ideals, or what law enforcement and others are suggesting, meaning why don't pay is so difficult in practice. And there's just so much nuance here. It would be, I think victims would appreciate if it was clear cut, just pay or don't pay, or do or don't do. And I like what Maria was saying about we're going to say don't pay, but we're going to provide resources so you're not out on your own, and there's support to go that path. But I'm curious what your take on all of this is.
Yes, thank you. No, I think I go along with Charles, though my instinct as a police officer, former police officer, is don't pay. Because from the physical world, the physical equivalent, when you get kidnapping for ransom, you negotiate, you ask for proof of life, and then you pay, but you actually follow the money. But I think in the cyber world, you can't follow the money so easily. So I can understand why people pay because even police departments have paid, right? But I think what's important is you need to negotiate, get in contact with the attacker, because then you buy time. You want to find out how deep he is in your network and whether he can repeat the attack or he's left something behind. And then you negotiate for a lower fee. It's actually to buy time. Of course, if you pay them, then they'll develop more tools. And I think in today's world, they can be as good as state-related threat actors in that they can infiltrate, stay in your network for a long time, look for all your crown jewels, and perhaps even figure out how much is your pain point, how much are you willing to pay. So they're getting more and more sophisticated because of the amount of money that they're getting. Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, and I'll say, look, nobody wants to pay threat actors. Nobody takes it lightly. Some people feel so coerced into doing it that they have no better choice. And one thing that that's really changed over the past 12 months is how threat actors are amplifying their attacks now. So years ago, what they would do is literally they reach out to people like you, maybe not you specifically, but other journalists out there, and they'd say, "Hey, we've hacked into company X. We've deployed ransomware, or we've stolen data from this victim organization, and will you write a story about it?" And some journalists would, some wouldn't. And now what's really changed is the threat actors have taken it into their own hands, and they've created these naming and shaming websites. So when they break into a company and they steal data from those organizations, they give the victim maybe 5 days or 7 days or some period of time before they publish information about the victim. And many times they'll say they've hacked into company X and they've got 7 days to pay. Otherwise, they're going to publish the data that was actually stolen. And it's interesting to see how that sometimes coerces people to pay. Sometimes it actually guarantees that a victim won't pay, because people know when you show up on a shaming site and then you disappear from the shaming site, the assumption is that you've paid, and nobody likes anybody to know that that a threat actor has been paid. But the key point is the threat actor is trying to amplify their hack by posting information on these shaming sites, and they understand that journalists will, they monitor that. They'll amplify the story. Maybe not obviously not intentional to support the threat actor, but ultimately it does end up supporting the threat actor in the process.
So Charles, I'd like to just follow up with what you just said. And I think one of the key things, we've touched on is the fact that your data is already compromised. Your network is already compromised. And I think sometimes that gets lost in the whole conversation. Your data, regardless of whether someone is telling you that we won't publish your data, you should already consider it as gone. And I think that in the heat of the moment, that is lost in some of the folks that are impacted. And so they do that knee-jerk reaction to, I do want to minimize my reputational damage. I do want to minimize, potential loss of business because of, the downtime, and they make these decisions. And it is a very tough decision, especially if you're a global entity or even a state entity that has, a lot of constituents that they have to support. But I still firmly believe that we have to continue to take a hardline approach so that this stops. They will shift their target and they'll shift their business model. But, I think that if we continue to fall victim to this, then we're just going to keep, perpetuating the cycle.
Yeah, I agree. Paying the threat actors absolutely perpetuates the problem. The challenge that we have is there's so many victims that feel no better option, but they pay. And so because so many people are paying, it's just going to continue until something very dramatic happens. And I know we'll spend a bit of time talking about what are potential ways in which we could mitigate the risk of ransomware and the extortion around it. But yeah, it's to me, I feel like it is the #1 cybersecurity problem out there, just because of the prevalence and the impact to organizations and to the people.
And Lily, I think I remember you writing in Wired about the Westermo case, the Finnish healthcare and mental health service provider. I think they had a few breaches and there was a ransom demand to keep their stolen data out of the public domain. and then after that, they attacked the patients and asked for money as well, which really was insidious.
Yeah.
And of course, you get complaints from your patients, your reputation falls to bits. I think the managing director was sacked. Yeah, terrible.
Right. And that was a mental health services group, therapy notes, really private stuff. There's so many different types of private data, but that was a type that felt very invasive. So I am glad you brought up that example. In the Q&A, a lot of people are asking about, and I think it's a good time to talk about this, the motivation of these actors, and maybe we can talk, Charles has brought up some specifics, but maybe we can talk specifically about some of the groups. People are asking about, right, this shift that's happening in 2020 from just, okay, people are, criminals are trying to make money and we get that as a motivation, to just such an extreme level of disruption, targeting healthcare, as we were mentioning, during an incredibly just morally black moment to target healthcare in particular. Not that it's ever acceptable, but during a pandemic. And also this year, we've seen actors move more firmly into targeting industrial control systems like energy sector, gas, electric, those types of things. The ransomware Ekans, I remember, specifically designed with components to shut down ICS specific systems and services. So I'm just wondering about, and people in the Q&A are asking as well, we still hear that this is all financially motivated and it's really being driven by criminal innovation, and all of you have been giving examples of the criminal innovation and transitions from one type of criminal action to ransomware in 2020. But can one of you, or all of you, chime in on why is it moving in such a dark direction? Is this where they need to go to just make as much money as they want to make? Or, how can it be that we're getting to such a dire and extreme point with this, all for criminals to just make some cash?
Yeah, so I've got a few thoughts on that, Lily. First of all, let's talk about the healthcare hacking. Not every threat actor is willing to cross the line to hit hospitals. And in fact, many ransomware groups have publicly stated they're not going to hit healthcare organizations, specifically hospitals, given the global pandemic that's going on right now. And we've actually seen many threat actors explicitly ignore or exclude hospitals from their targeting. Sometimes we see certain threat actors end up gaining access to hospitals and then deploying encryptors, and then later realizing that they've actually hit a hospital. And I've seen these communications between the victims and the threat actors where it is very clear to me the threat actors didn't realize they hit a hospital. And you might ask, well, how do you know? How is it possible they didn't know they hit a hospital? So a lot of hospitals are associated with universities. And so sometimes we believe the threat actor thought they hit a university or another research institution, which, by the way, to them is fair game from a hacking perspective. And so they've chosen not to hit hospitals. Whereas we've seen some specific groups deliberately focus on hospital organizations. And they did that largely for financial reasons, because they felt that hospitals feel compelled to pay, and they pay quickly and they pay a lot of money. And so that's why we saw about a month ago a very acute targeting of hospital organizations by a very specific Eastern European criminal group. And many folks in government and Mandiant and Microsoft and others raised the alarm because we were so concerned about the sheer volume of hospitals that were being hacked and just the overall impact to that. In terms of, what's the motivation? I'll tell you from my organic firsthand observation, and we've worked with over 1,000 organizations dealing with this, it largely seems focused on financially motivated reasons. So most of the criminals that we see are doing this because they want money. With that said, we certainly have plenty of examples where we believe nation states have deployed a ransomware And they've done it in such a way where they weren't financially motivated, but they were looking to obscure the attack and maybe throw a false flag and make it look like somebody else was doing it. Because most people would reasonably assume that a nation state operator doesn't need to ask for $1 million because they're a government. They have billions or trillions of dollars. And so we've seen that. I anticipate we will see that more in the future, where state-sponsored operators deploy ransomware as maybe a final part of their intrusion after they've already done what they actually intended to do, to make it look like this was a financially motivated operation. So we're not seeing a whole lot of that yet, but I do anticipate we will start to see more of that in the coming years.
And following on to what Charles mentioned, from a state and local government perspective, we have not seen or received any indication of any kind of nation state type attacks against us. It's been generally what we call the spray and pray method, where they're looking at low hanging fruit. And I hate to say it, but local government, sometimes we appear to be low hanging fruit because of the lack of resources that we can bring to bring to bear to protect the network, so on and so forth, or the lack of cyber hygiene. One of the things that we all hate to do, but it really makes a difference if we do it well and make ourselves a hardened target. So that's the initiatives that we're working on in the state is how can we strengthen our security posture across the board. And we're doing this by going out to these entities, doing proactive assessments on their environment, giving them a structured way of identifying what the remediation processes will be so that they make themselves as hard as possible, educating also the IT staff members that are there. But yeah, it's definitely not, because we all know that if there's a nation state out there and they're trying to get you, it's going to be hard. They'll probably succeed. That's just the way that it is. But it's been the spray and pray that we've been seeing at state and local.
Yeah, maybe I'll just chime in here. I've been a victim of a nation state attack. I'm actually also on the board of a public health service, healthcare service. In fact, it's the largest public healthcare service in Singapore. We cover half of the nation's hospitals. And we were subject to an attack from 2017 with data exfiltrated in 2018. This was before COVID. 1.5 million patients' data were taken, but more importantly, among the group of VIPs, our Prime Minister's data, thankfully not the diagnosis and all that, just his prescriptions, and mine included also, have been taken. And we presume that it's for intelligence purposes, but I'm sure today these things will carry on. And as Charles pointed out, they could be disguised as ransomware attacks because the tools are basically the same. Yeah, so very tough.
And I'm curious also, Khoo, your thoughts about, maybe we can move into talking a bit about, what can be done to change this. And I'm curious about your thoughts on international norms, law enforcement in this regard, if this is nation state activity, or if that, continues to rise in the future as it relates to ransomware. How do we establish acceptable behavior, for something like that, especially when there can be potential, industrial control services, loss of life, critical, infrastructure impact. But if it's all criminal, if it's criminally motivated, still, what are the standards and expectations globally about how we're going to deal with this? Because, as horrendous as scamming and sort of theft of money is, this is even worse because it's starting to tip into these other, areas.
Yes, I think there are quite a few nations who are concerned about this, concerned enough to sponsor things that are going on in the UN. I think you all are aware that we've had groups of government experts meeting, and everyone is waiting for the results of the latest one, and together with the open-ended working group. I think there are already agreed norms by all nations from the 2015 Group of Government Experts report. Some of these norms of behavior expected of states, there are limiting norms, like states should not knowingly allow their territory to be used for internationally wrongful acts using ICTs. States should not conduct or knowingly support ICT activity that intentionally damages critical infrastructure. States should cooperate to increase stability and security in the use of ICTs and to prevent harmful practices. States should consider how best to cooperate, to exchange information, to assist each other, and to prosecute terrorists and criminal use of ICTs. States should respond to appropriate requests for assistance by other states whose critical infrastructure is subject to malicious ICT acts. Well, these are all accepted, but unfortunately, who is watching, who follows the norms? I think that is the dilemma, and it speaks to the diplomatically sensitive issues that are the reality today. So I'm still hopeful that things will work out at the UN because the two chairs of the two groups have been meeting. One is a multi-stakeholder one, and one is a group that just consists of government experts. And that's why I joined the CyberPeace Institute, because we are committed to helping the common man as well as trying to deal with some of these issues. As some of you who go through our website will know, we try this through assistance to increase the civilians' digital resilience and provide assistance in their response and recovery after cyber attacks, accountability to close the accountability gap through collaborative analysis of cyber attacks, and advancement of international law and norms in order to promote responsible behavior in cyberspace. So a bit of advertisement. We did sign, I think some of us signed something to say that please do not attack healthcare, and we got some renowned people to do it. Also, we started this Cyber for Healthcare, where 4 is a 4. And we try to do things like matching volunteers to people in need, and we do it in a way which will provide free services. And we've done labs to help people as well. I think on the other hand, the Interpol is trying to also get the police around the world to collaborate, to work with the cybersecurity company, because we know private has a lot of information, and to do capacity building as well as to call out threats. Yeah, but not easy to get the criminals. Even if you indict them, you might not be able to get them out of the country, but at least you can disrupt their activities. Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, and some folks in the Q&A are asking about, policy, building on what you were talking about, and particularly, how do you disrupt the business model? And I'm wondering, Charles or Maria, if you have thoughts about that. What are some, it's just such a brutal barrage right now. What are some brute force instruments that defenders have in their pocket?
Maria, do you want to go first?
Sure. From a defender standpoint, well, let's start with the high level, the administrative piece of it. We are within the state of North Carolina. We are working on legislation right now. We're hoping to propose with the next session to ensure that local or government entities do not pay the ransomware. So we're hoping that that passes, that we'll have some legislation that prohibits the use of or the paying of ransomware. But it's really, and I hate to, well, I'm going to use this saying, it warms the cockles of my heart when hearing from a global front that there's a lot of collaboration that's going on, because I think that that's key. Within North Carolina, we had to last year enact legislation to facilitate the sharing of information between the local government, because they've in the past operated independently of the state agencies. but now we're sharing and collaborating a lot more. And I think that will help us understand the breadth and the issues that we're dealing with, you know, from a statewide perspective. We have 100 counties within the state of North Carolina, 532 municipals. So it's huge, and we have to figure out how we can secure the infrastructure. From a tools and techniques perspective, I mentioned before the National Guard, there are cyber teams that are out there, cyber response forces, partnering with our local IT folks that are there. And we're also putting tools and capabilities on the infrastructure to help to reduce the attacks that are coming at these entities. So something that's more proactive, not another tool that's alerting and only causing more noise for these entities that are under-resourced. So there's tools out there, and we're also looking at, you know, a whole of state approach to cybersecurity, which includes continuous monitoring the networks, making sure there's another eyes on glass, making sure that there's something that's proactively blocking and alerting. You know, so between the information sharing and the tools, we are circling the wagon on that.
Charles, do you have any last thoughts on that? We're getting to the end of our time about, you know, how to kind of crack this nut.
Yeah, absolutely. So just a few thoughts. One, you know, because at Mandiant we see so much ransomware all the time, we decided, you know, hey, we're going to document what our playbook is when we get engaged by organizations and just get that out there. So we produced a 24-page document, step-by-step instructions for organizations to use in the event that they get hit with ransomware. But ideally, in preparation for a ransomware attack, it's just really good technical steps to mitigate the risk of it. But beyond that, as I think about what government can do or what the community can do, there's a few things that I think will really help. I don't think there's a magic answer that solves everything, but I do want to share a few learnings. One, I see law enforcement and other companies out there doing a pretty good job of notifying victims that they have an attacker in the environment, and giving them enough time to eradicate the attacker before they have the ability to either steal data or deploy encryptors across the environment. So I'd love to see law enforcement and commercial entities continuing to do that. Two, the sanctions process actually works. It works in varying ways, but to give you one example, you know, there are two individuals out of Iran that were behind the SamSam operation. After the indictment, of those individuals, we didn't see any further intrusions by that threat actor. And so that was the indictment. From a sanctions perspective, the folks behind you know, Evil Corp or the Drydex operation, you know, because they've been sanctioned and because there's belief that they are tied to the Wastelocker ransomware operation, we see very few victims paying the threat actor because of, you know, fear of violating sanctions. And so I do understand there's a double-edged sword with respect to sanctions. It helps, it hurts, it creates a lot of confusion for victim organizations that are already in a really tough position. But I do know that it helps a little bit, and I know the intention is positive. Obviously, the arrests, anytime a threat actor could get identified and arrested, it's always a good thing. And you know that when, you know, some of these individuals that, you know, come into a pretty substantial wealth over a short period of time, you know, they want to travel, you know, they want to enjoy the money, and you know, they can be picked up when they leave their countries and travel to a place that have extradition laws with the United States. And then the last thing I'd say is, to the extent the government can disrupt some of the infrastructure that the attackers are using and make more pain for the threat actor, cost them more money, it may mitigate some of the risk. Now, granted, there could certainly be you know, recourse from that. People could get upset because it might cost more money for them. They may ask for more in ransom and extortion demands. But I'd love to see, you know, more actions being taken to try to curb this. And I do think it's going to continue to be a pretty big problem unless something drastic happens.
Yeah, it's such a tough issue. We could be talking about it for hours, and you've all been so great. Maria, Khoo, Boon, and Charles, thank you so much for being here, and thanks to Aspen, and thanks to everyone for your great questions. I'm sorry we couldn't get to more of them, but we tried to do a sort of speedy address of as many of these issues as possible. Like Charles was saying, this is just such a crucial issue in 2020 and going into 2021. So thank you all, and enjoy the next panel.